Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the meeting. Could I ask everyone please to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. And members of the public may like to follow us at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Fire for this meeting. Laura, have there been any apologies, please?
Chairman, we've received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Eshlomi and Assembly Member Curtin.
Fine, thank you. Are there any other declarations? Can we note declarations of interest? Thank you. Can we agree the minutes of the committee meeting on the 19th of July 2018?
Agreed.
Can we note the completed and ongoing actions?
Agreed.
Right, to the main part of the meeting, and I welcome Fiona Twycross, Assembly Member, who is the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, and Dany Cotton, London Fire Commissioner. Welcome. And I also say welcome to Sue Budden, Director of Corporate Services for the London Fire Brigade, Dan Daly, Assistant Commissioner, and Tim Powell, Assistant Director for People's Services. Should we need to ask for your assistance, then join in. But the main bulk of questions would, of course, go to Fiona or Dany. Thank you. So I'll kick off with the questions, and it's on headline performance. So, what steps are the brigade taking to address the recent increase in fire deaths?
So obviously one of the things we do is we look across the piece. So fire deaths over a sort of 10-year period, go back 10 years and 5 years, are still showing a decrease, which is fantastic news because obviously any fire death is one too many. Because the numbers are so low now, where we occasionally have an increase in numbers, it does look as though we've got, you know, a percentage spike. But actually this year, the number of fire deaths, one of the main causes of the increase, unfortunately, is due to some deliberate fire deaths which we've had, which has been unfortunate, and obviously ones that we have very little control over, and those come into either the category of suicide or someone else causing harm to somebody. And obviously those, unfortunately, are ones which the police are then involved in investigating. But where we have got the accidental fire deaths, obviously, as you know, we always do the fatal fire review. We look into trying to see whether there are any trends or patterns. Obviously, you know, the fire last year is still showing us an increase in the overall fire deaths from Grenfell. But the pattern so far this year is not showing a huge increase. And where we have got those fire deaths, we are looking very closely. Obviously, sadly, some of those ones in the accidental fire deaths are still people who are vulnerable adults, who are the people we specifically want to target. That involves doing a lot of close working with our partners to ensure that not only we can find out about those people, but we can make sure we take the steps to be able to get into their houses, not only to assist them, but to assist the people who are caring for them to make sure the right steps are in place.
Thank you.
Yeah. If I can add, as Dany said, any death from fires, one too many, so it's something that I've been asking quite a lot of questions about, particularly, I think earlier this year there was a month or so when it felt like it was almost sort of 2-3 times a week, which is sort of considerably higher than we've seen in some of the previous years. And we had a report at my I've got a monthly Deputy Mayor's Fire and Resilience Board meeting now with senior officers at the brigade and the head of London Resilience, and I had a report on fire deaths specifically at the meeting last month, and officers felt that they needed a few more months' data before they could sort of identify any particular trends. But as Dany said, we did see a run of deliberate fire deaths, which is sort of extremely distressing to sort of hear the detail about. And I've also asked the brigade to look into whether there's any issues around social care, because obviously, as members will be aware, the majority of the people who suffer fire death come into the category of vulnerable people, and if they're not in contact with other agencies, they really should be. So next week at my board meeting, I've got the October board meeting next week. I've asked for an update report on this, and it's something that we'll continue to look at over coming months, and happy to, when we do have the additional data that officers felt they needed, very happy to talk to the committee about it in greater depth.
Thank you. Gareth, did you want to comment?
Yeah, it's just on the deliberate fire deaths question. How many are we talking about? How many of those were suicide, and how many were...
Unfortunately, the ones we've had in the latest spike have all been murder.
Murder? How many?
3, which is the greatest rate we've had since 2011. We had 3 in 1 month. Unfortunately, one involving a child.
So are we talking about arson, or are we talking about
Arson.
pouring petrol over people?
No, actually arson in property. So deliberate fire setting of a property resulting in loss of life.
Have convictions followed those?
They're under police investigation, but they have got arrests in all those cases.
Thank you, that's all I wanted, because that's unusual, and that's...
Yeah, it's it is very unusual, and it's a tragic thing, and we wanted to make sure, and in fact I've been asking colleagues whether or not they've seen any increase in that as a potential threat, using arson as a method of harming people. Unfortunately, with some of those, it appears they may be related to drug crime.
And one of those involved a child. Of what age?
7.
Died.
Yeah.
And the awful tragedy of that is he wanted to be a firefighter. So it was a very unpleasant thing. His mother is still poorly, but we've been working really closely with his school to try and support the children in his school. We took a fire helmet down there for them to sign because they really wanted to be involved in that. So, and because they all knew of his desire to be a firefighter, we've gone down and done some quite close work in the community around there to try and support the local children as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Did the increase in calls to the London Fire Brigade between April and June continue over the summer months?
The call rate for the...
Just the increase in calls generally?
So what we did see over the summer months was a massive increase in calls to open fires and things like parks and woodland areas. In fact, it's our busiest summer. We attended twice as many calls during that period as we did last year. So we attended just under 2,000 fires that were recorded as grassland, woodland and crop fires during June, July and August. During that time, as you're aware, we also sent several resources out of London to support our colleagues in Lancashire and Manchester, who are obviously suffering those appalling fires up there in the moorland. What we did was we used firefighters who volunteered on their off-duty days and not frontline fire engines to go up there, and we had deployment up there for about 7 or 8 days supporting those colleagues up there who were really stretched because of the grassland fires. But we had our largest open grassland fire at Wanstead Flats. We had 40 fire engines there which burned for a number of days. Obviously due to the nature of the fire there, it's quite deep-seated, so it's really difficult to get into, but it is definitely the busiest summer we've had. And as part of that, I wrote to all the local councils to ask them to put a temporary ban in on barbecuing in public spaces, and to actually make sure they were extra vigilant about things like rubbish being dumped, and actually monitoring things like just litter being left with glass or people smoking in open areas. And we've also had our teams going out trying to do local recce's as well to ensure that we spot where there might be potential arson areas.
Yes, I was pleased to see you did that because that makes a difference, and working with the boroughs makes sense.
How many councils actually followed your request?
A vast majority, and lots wrote back, and in fact, interestingly, quite a few of them started writing back in September to ask me if they could then have barbecues back again. So we did say not still, because unfortunately, due to the fact it still has been very dry, there's still large areas of dry, open areas that we wouldn't want to, and we saw an increase over the last 2 weeks again in grass fires where we've been going back out to them. So we've said, can we wait till we have a sustained period of rain and lots of green grass before they start doing it? By which time hopefully people have been deterred from the thought of barbecuing.
Okay, thank you. I mean, given that you were sending resource up north and we were so busy, how did we cope with our resources? Did we have plenty of tenders,
and because we used our firefighters who weren't on duty, frontline firefighters, to deploy up north, we asked for volunteers in their off-duty days, so that didn't actually impact on our frontline resources at the time. There were times where it was exceedingly busy, where we had lots of crews out on grass fires, but at no point did we ever run low on resources, and we were still able to obviously cover all our normal fire calls.
And actually the barbecue ban did seem to prevent quite a lot of fires because they did die down after council started taking action. So it showed that the preventative work actually sort of paid off.
It's something to view in years to come, because when we've done preventative work like that before, I remember when the union went on strike over one bonfire night, we had less fires I think that year than ever before, because people were concerned that the Fire Brigade weren't there to put the fires out. So perhaps that might be something we can look at. Talking about bonfires, etc., how are you preparing for the extra demand because of Diwali and Halloween, bonfire night, etc.?
So we find that's a really good time of year to be able to get across a lot of fire safety messaging. Obviously those 3 things occur in a very short time period, just under 2 weeks. Obviously a lot of associated activity around additional bonfires, fireworks, candles, all of those posing additional risks to people. We will continue to press the message that we would encourage people to go to well-organised fireworks events and not have them at home because of the risks themselves and other people around from, you know, fireworks in back gardens and also bonfires. But we've been doing a lot of specific targeting also around the use of candles. And one of our boroughs has been doing a lot of work with the local community about using battery-operated tea-light candles rather than actually having candles with naked flames, because last year we had about, over the last 3 years, about 1,000 fires that we've attributed to candle use. A lot of those in religious shrines that unfortunately then cause domestic fires and damage to property. So we have been doing a lot of work and messaging about safe use of candles, and where we can push the sort of battery-operated ones instead, obviously it's far safer for people. But we will continue to press the messages about making sure, you know, you buy fireworks with the right standard marks on them, not allowing children to be near them, not using fireworks in conjunction with alcohol and all the things that we know are risk factors. Last year was an exceptionally busy year for us for bonfire nights. It does very much depend on the weather, as always, so, you know, not wishing to be humbug, but we do like it to be a little cold and dark and wet on bonfire night to
We've all got to do a rain dance.
Yes, that would be
I'm up
perfect for that. But yes, obviously we're doing a lot of work with the local communities to try and encourage and support the right activities and well-organised public events rather than local events in people's back gardens.
The Chair might be interested in the fact that the work on the electric tea lights is actually in Harrow. So,
we had a very bad fire in Harrow because a candle was left on. I know because it was above my shop, and the place went up so quickly. A few years ago. So
so we are finding, you know, that the people are very responsive and very supportive of the idea of us going and helping them to obviously minimise those fires, especially, you know, where it is related to. And it's also things like people don't understand the concept of tea lights. If you put them on the edge of a bath or a television set, that they will melt through and actually catch fire to it. People assume because they're in a metal container that they're flame-proof, but actually the heat from them we find quite regularly burn through televisions and set fires that way. So it is about the education piece and continuing to reinforce that safety message.
okay, lovely, thank you. I want to ask you about vision now. To what extent has vision improved the way control staff deal with emergency calls and station-based staff receive information and are mobilised to them?
So I'm very pleased to report that, you know, obviously we had some earlier teething problems with vision and we are now over those, and the overall general picture of vision is very positive. In terms of response, our first appliance performance for 2018 is the fastest of the last 10 years. So we're definitely seeing an increase in the reducing attendance times and our fire engines getting out the door. We're finding that, you know, now we've got the new system, the automatic call distribution up and running. That's come back in July, and that is actually making sure that our calls get distributed in a far better way to actually control officers. And I've visited control several times recently, and control officers are far more positive about vision and about the way they interact with it, and the fact that it is now paying great dividends in improving our response times.
Yes, and I would congratulate you on those response times. They're coming the way we want them to, so I'm pleased about that. What about when the system goes down completely?
So we haven't seen any of those. So we had a few of those obviously very early on. We haven't had any of those in the recent past, which we are very pleased about. We have also Capita have got a new customer service manager that they've put onto us specifically to engage with London Fire Brigade, and Tom George meets with him regularly, so we've got a far better customer interface with Capita as well. So where we do have any problems, we've got a much better link in to ensure those problems are resolved in a faster way, and, you know, far more personal to us because they understand our contract and the customer focus for us.
Okay, so when was the last time it all failed?
Oh, 18 months, 2 years ago. It's not the last time. The last major one we had was a very long time ago.
Okay, minor ones?
Nothing. So when they put new, what they call patches and new fixes on, sometimes those aren't as successful, so they've had to take a couple of those, but they've not actually interfered at all in the functionality of vision and the mobilising system itself.
Okay, so we're fairly relaxed about it now, are we?
Yes,
eventually.
much more so. Yes.
I wouldn't
Seem to
say
have been
relaxed.
talking
I
about this
think
for a
that
while.
there's been quite a lot of vigilance by officers, and I went down there myself 2 or 3 weeks ago, and will concur with what the Commissioner said about the control officers being much more comfortable with the system and much more confident about it. I mean, people still do the exercises where they practice as if it were going down. So they do still exercise to make sure that they have backup plans if it does go down. And I think I know that the Commissioner is very keen for members to go down and see the control officers in person. And when I went, I was basically allowed to wander around by myself and ask questions without any supervision. So you actually then do get, as people beware, you then actually do get people's genuine opinion about how things are working, and people are pretty confident with it.
So you're happy with the contingency arrangements?
Yes, I am.
Okay, fine. Andrew?
Yeah, well, just before we go off vision, one of the issues that I raised before was the extent to which Vision was mobilising from neighbouring brigades when we also had resources that just as close. This particularly came up in relation to Barnet and Hertfordshire on the border there. And the net result is it costing us a lot more through the mutual aid arrangements. Has that been fixed, or is that still going on?
It will automatically pick the nearest fire engine, so if there is a neighbouring fire and rescue service one, obviously for us it is about the attendance time as quickly as possible, so the system will automatically select whichever is geographically nearest, and those are whole-time fire engines, not retained duty fire engines. So if that does mean selecting an over-border one, that will still happen because they are geographically nearer and they're able to attend the call quicker.
But does that include taking into account the road network?
It takes into account all the information data that Vision has that it uses the road network and mapping on it. So, we do find that we are having other fire engines come in, but equally we're going out to different fire and rescue services that use Vision as well because we're geographically nearer. So it kind of balances out fairly equally across the piece.
Do all the neighbouring brigades use Vision?
Vast majority of them do, yes. It's pretty much one of the only main mobilising systems around at the moment. So most of our neighbours are on Vision.
And following on Capita, there's been a lot of difficulty with Capita, as you probably know, in terms of their finances. And I know in Barnet it's been a major issue, and in fact Barnet Council is actually looking at bringing some of the things that Capita do back in-house again if they can. What contingency is there in case Capita goes belly up?
So we look at all of our, and as part of the GLA group, we look across the piece at all of the companies that we do business with and look at the possibilities of what happens and what the backup contingencies are. As far as other systems, obviously it would be very difficult to bring and implement another mobilising system, but we constantly monitor the market to understand what is happening with other companies. It wouldn't be something you could resolve overnight to bring another mobilising system, and obviously that you understand the difficulties have with training and development bringing it in, but it is something we look at as part of the GLA family. There is a group that actually looks across all the business continuity for all the major businesses, and what we have done as part of that is look at where we have where we share companies, because what they want an understanding of is risk areas where different parts of it, so different emergency services or any parts of the group, use the same company for something if there was a risk.
So you're not worried about that?
Not at this moment, so.
Touch wood.
Well, we can't, I can't predict more of that, but not this moment in time, no.
Okay. Could it go on to the emergency services network?
Yes.
And the delays in bringing that on? We heard a bit about this from in the police committee, I think it was last week.
Yeah.
What's the impact on London Fire Brigade?
So at the moment there is no impact because obviously until the emergency service network is up and running we continue to use Airwave, and there's been an extension on the Airwave contract, and Airwave is obviously our main means of communication, use that. So at the moment there is no impact. Obviously we are fully aware of what's going on and we're kept in touch with the project and the developments for that, and I understand there's now 2 stages where they're talking about bringing the data service in first and then critical voice in next. So we're fully tapped in and we have someone who sits on the project. So at the moment there is no impact on London Fire Brigade, and we will continue to use Airwave as with the other emergency services until the emergency service network is fully up and running.
And when it does come up and running, will it deal with some of the communication problems we've seen in buildings with lots of concrete floors and underground?
Potentially, I don't know until we can have it up and running and tested, and then we couldn't give that assurance. But the anticipation is that it will provide clear communication mobile network.
Do you think it'll work sufficiently well and reliably for the things that we need? Because it does seem to have been a bit of a dog's breakfast.
Well, we hope it will. We are promised it won't come on the run and be live until it is fully functional.
And what would you do if the 4G system went down during a major incident?
Well, at the moment, they are saying we're not going to have this up and running until they can guarantee that won't happen. So, you know, we have to believe and trust in the project that it won't deliver and won't be put live and into action until they can guarantee that for us, because obviously being able to communicate in the event of a major incident is key for us.
Yeah. Well, we heard that when the vision first came in, didn't we? And it didn't quite work that way.
Unfortunately, this is a government-led project, so we aren't in control of it.
And what's the potential cost implications if it keeps going over?
So for us, obviously, at the moment, we're not bearing the cost of it because the extension's been made to the airwave. So I don't know ultimately what the cost would be. It depends how long it takes to come in and how long the extension on the airwave licence is.
I think one of the concerns with it is genuinely that people don't know how much it will cost if and when it comes online, and it's one of the things that the Local Government Association has raised in conjunction with Roy Wilshire from the National Fire Chiefs Council, because obviously it's a national project, is that it's sort of been 7 years and we haven't seen the fruits of it yet, and also the cost implications not just to us here in London but to other fire and rescue services just haven't really been quantified.
Okay, right, thank you. Second section now is on staffing and recruitment, and Leonie's going to ask.
Yeah, so back to talking about sickness and well-being, which obviously is a subject that we've talked about many times at LFIPA previously, and it's still a bit of a concern, I think, the number of days lost to sickness at the moment, and I'm looking at the figures here going back over a number of years, and it definitely does seem that it's higher again this year, despite perhaps best efforts. And I wonder if you could just give us a headline about what's going on, and that seems to be operational staff, fire and rescue staff and control staff. It's up in all categories.
It is, and it's a great concern to me. Unfortunately, we now have our highest category of sickness as being stress, anxiety and depression, particularly pertinent today on World Mental Health Day. And there is a direct correlation between the Grenfell incident itself and the inquiry and a lot of our recent sickness absence. The impact and the stress that people have felt by giving evidence and being required to give evidence to the inquiry has resulted in a number of people booking sick, both operational firefighters, officers and control staff. It is something that we have a huge concern about at the moment, and it is something that Tim, who's come in as our new head, is one of the things I've asked him specifically to focus on, is how we address those issues of sickness absence. Unfortunately, the policy that we brought in 2016 is not bearing fruits at the moment, so one of the things I have tasked Tim with doing is doing a full review of our sickness absence policy. In the meantime, we've delivered some training on the policy as it is to try and assist people with their implementation on it. I don't feel, and I've had conversations with the trade unions as well, that it's working in the way we'd like it to be able to reduce it. So we want to combine a package of care and health and well-being and mental health and support with making sure we have the right measures in place to actually deal with the sickness absence as and when it occurs, to ensure that, you know, we are addressing it, we are encouraging and supporting people to return to work, and making sure that, you know, they are not off for unduly long periods of time, because we all know it's well recognised that the longer people spend away from work, it's much harder for them to come back to work, especially when they've been off for things like stress and anxiety.
Sure, I mean obviously that is becomes quite complicated, and it's one of those areas where you both need to manage sickness and have those parameters so that people are very clear, but at the same time, obviously, if people, you know, have got illnesses and are not malingering, which I hardly think is, you know, very widespread in the fire service necessarily, so I wouldn't want to imply that, but also giving people that support to help them back in, because as you say, reintegration, if you've been off for a long time. Can I just pick you up on what you were saying about the new policies introduced in 2016? Because the figures I'm looking at do actually show that for two categories of staff, there was actually a dip in the sickness levels in 2017, that it was starting to come down over 16 and 17. So do you think the stress, anxiety and depression is coming back up more now because people are being forced to revisit Grenfell and concern about giving evidence and that sort of thing? Whereas obviously that was in the period immediately after Grenfell perhaps, and when you might have thought operational staff might have been more affected?
Interestingly, a lot of operational staff in the immediate time after Grenfell had a desire to be at work and be with each other and support each other and be on watches, whereas the further time has got away, there have been people who've only now started very recently processing the information that happened, and the amount of stress that people were placed under when they received a notification to say they were going to give evidence to the inquiry was enormous. We have to recognise that frontline firefighters control staff, it's not a situation they normally find themselves in, giving evidence in a public inquiry, televised, watched by how many people, and they found it very, very difficult. We had one member of staff in control who, just the pressure and the feeling of doing that they've been absent from work for some considerable time, just for the stress of that, because it is making them revisit the situation. They know they're being questioned, they know that the families are there, and it's speaking from personal experience, it is a very difficult situation to be in. We have introduced a number of initiatives at work which we're currently doing at the moment about using mind and training up people to do blue light support staff. We're having new training policies for watch managers and people on fire stations. And we've got a number of different mental health initiatives to support people in the workplace, both in their sort of team workplace levels and then at managerial level as well. And bring in different intervention support. Obviously our counselling team continue to be employed full-time dealing with people. I have to say that they have been absolutely fantastic in the level of support they gave during the inquiry. Every single day in the inquiry we had one of our counselling team in the inquiry available constantly to provide support to the people who were there. It's been a huge challenge for them, but the support they gave was so well appreciated by everybody, just to be able to have that intervention during the breaks, to be able to talk to somebody. So
that's interesting also, because I'm not, I wouldn't claim to be an expert of any description in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but I do believe that is a feature of people who suffer from it, that they can sort of deal with it in the very short term, immediate aftermath with various coping mechanisms, including perhaps coming into work and running around and not thinking about it, but that eventually it sort of catches up with you. So maybe it's the combination of being asked to go to the inquiry, which obviously is extremely stressful, asking people to relive, as well as all that media attention, plus that combination. Do you feel that the brigade then has got enough support in place now for, as I said, it's not an expert area for me, you've got those experts able to offer sufficient...
And a lot of the pressure people felt was actually about being able to give the best evidence, to be able to provide the right information to help support what was happening, and that additional pressure where you don't want to be letting people down really, really played a huge toll on people.
So do you think, I don't want to say, can you guarantee that sickness levels will come down for next year? Because I think would be a ridiculous question. But do you think that the brigade has done enough now to explore how to start addressing this issue and start to help see the figures coming down? There must be some people within the organisation perhaps who've got areas where it hasn't gone up. Is there any good practice that can be shared? Do you have any examples of what has been happening? And it sounds as though obviously the Grenfell situation is going to continue to need to be dealt with.
What we have done, and very interestingly, and a lot of work we're doing at the moment, is about using people from teams, so firefighters from watches who have a particular skill set or passion, to actually go out and speak to other teams. So we have a firefighter who has been going out, and it's made it his mission, very much like Simon Jakeman did, as the Green Champions, go out to all the watches. This firefighter has particular experience himself with having suffered from periods of really poor mental health and having, openly talking about the fact he tries to take his life, and goes to watches and gives an input. And the
thing out, sickness has always been, having been on LFIPA for many years, sickness has always been a major problem. Has the development of the Healthy Living Portal made any difference at all, in any respect?
I guess it's difficult to say. When you listen to everything that Dany's described there in relation to what we're doing, and then you take the portal in addition to that, it's always difficult, I think, to take one thing in isolation and be able to quantify the actual difference that one thing has made. What I would say it's done is it's kind of given it's a very accessible tool for all staff to get into, to help kind of explore various issues around health, absence, well-being, and so forth. So that can only be a good thing in terms of having that kind of communication method, open to staff. Whether it's made huge amounts of difference, at the same time as when we've kind of increased counselling teams, at the same time we're going through attendance management policy changes and supporting managers to that, I think it's difficult to quantify.
Okay, another aspect of this is when I did all my trips around all the fire stations, the one thing that kept coming back to me, and I have mentioned it before, was that officers were telling me that they would take the odd few days off because they couldn't book holiday. and they wanted to go away, and there was a major issue there. Now, I was told this right across London. Is there any work, has any work gone into those specific days of holidays that are in the high holiday periods that may or may not?
I think one of the things we're hoping is that when we get to full establishment, this is something that people will be able to get the time off they need. Because I think you're right, that particularly anecdotally, there's instances clearly where you get spikes at particular times, so around sort of key holiday periods. And anecdotally, one of the issues, and actually the representative bodies also recognise this, is that people want one day off and then they get signed off for several days because of how the system works or has worked. And I think that it's something that we're hoping in combination with the work Tim will be doing on the attendance policy will be partly addressed by when we do have full establishment. You should have people not being refused leave when they want it to the same extent.
Well, I hope we really drill down into that, because I have
absolutely.
been mentioning this now for around 4 or 5 years. So, and if we do keep seeing the same spikes, we have to be asking ourselves that question.
No, absolutely, and I think that it's recognised. It causes bad feeling when people perceive it to be happening, because obviously not everybody does it, otherwise we wouldn't have anybody in the brigade. So I think it is something that I'd be keen to make sure we saw sort of a move away from in the future. And also the work that's being done on sickness and attendance is also covering other areas of well-being as well as mental health. So I think we're due to go and see the nutrition pilot in December, which is the type of initiative that hopefully will also help sort of long-term health and sort of avoid people developing sort of those negative complaints people get later on in life.
I think the kinder aspect is good, and you're doing really well. It's the not so kinder aspect, as in people just taking days off.
Well, that's the bit that
and that's important, because I mean, you touched on it. It does really irritate the firefighters that don't do it yet still want time off. So it causes problems within the ranks as well. Did you want to comment?
Just a quick one. Going back to the previous discussion about post-Grenfell and sickness, have you actually tallied the sickness for stress and so forth as against the Grenfell, people who are actually at Grenfell? So you can actually have it's not just we think this is what's happening, you can actually show it's what's happening.
Absolutely.
Right, and if you were to take out the Grenfell related sickness, what impact would that have on the figures?
So obviously reduce them. We are still seeing that stress, anxiety and depression on it overall is increasing across the workforce. In some ways, weirdly, it's something that I'm pleased that people are being honest about and talking about. So previously in the past, I think people might not have been honest about what they were going sick with and how they were feeling. People had it hidden, or said they had something else wrong with them. So like a lot of things, sometimes because you're opening up and allowing people to be honest and taking away some of the stigma, you then sometimes see an increase in people reporting it. So we need to keep an eye on that as a longer term trend, but it is something we're closely scrutinising at the moment, and that's why we want to make sure we've got all the other interventions in place to support people, because we recognise in society a lot of work that people are doing around the hideous suicide rates for men at certain ages, and obviously as our workforce is still predominantly male, then that is something that I want to make sure we're targeting. Obviously it's something that there is now a suicide person in the government, so it's something that everyone is looking at very seriously, and something we take seriously because we do recognise those risk factors. And I think there is still the association with people assuming that firefighters are roughy-tufty people who won't suffer from any of that, and then it gives them less ability to talk about it. So for me, the more we can increase the conversation, the more we can make sure people are aware. Yes, we might then see a spike in reporting, but then the stuff we put in behind the scenes will hopefully help to address that.
Okay, thank you, Melanie.
No problem. So coming back to recruitment, staffing and recruitment and diversity, if we can start with looking at increasing the number of women, and then we'll move on to looking at black and minority ethnic communities and increasing diversity. As we know, the brigade is not exactly covered itself in glory in this area in the past. You've got some targets, and although I think we've seen a welcome increase in the recruitment of female trainees in 17-18, you are still short of your targets, and I just wondered how are you able to use, and perhaps also particularly use you as the leading person within the Fire Brigade, how are you able to use female staff and officers to promote and encourage further women to join? Seems to be moving in the right direction. Is there more that can be done? What can we do?
I definitely think there's more to be done. I think it's a piece of constant work we'll carry on with. We obviously did the piece of research, but we're now acting on the results of that. We've done a lot of work around the firefighting sexism and challenging gender stereotype, which has been obviously in the national media. And although that has caused some backlash for some people, the fact the conversation is being had and being spoken about does mean it's raising the profile, and lots more people are talking about women in the role of firefighters. We're doing where we can in every single circumstance where we have the opportunity to present ourselves in the media, whether it's doing information, safety messaging. We try to make sure we have a mixed crew of firefighters who are there, or the spokesperson is someone who's representing one of our underrepresented groups, just to have people have that visual role model. And I think that, you know, the more I'm out there doing those things, I go to a lot of events where young girls are thinking about career choices, and speaking to them about the opportunities wherever possible, and where I encourage, you know, we have a lot of our women firefighters who are happy to do that, and what we do is we provide them with media training to support them so that they feel they're able to be comfortable and confident to go on to, you know, TV or radio and actually talk about the role of a firefighter and support other people. We've done a lot of online targeting, so we've used a lot of through social networking, because obviously social media is the way a lot of people communicate, and to make sure there's lots of social media imaging about the role of women and women as firefighters. And obviously one of the things that I'm really passionate about is the use of our fire cadets. I'm constantly amazed every time I go and see our fire cadets. I went to the Pass Out Old Kent Road for the last year's fire cadets, and I think out of the 18 or 19 cadets, only 3 of them were men, and the rest were young women. And they were the most fantastic mix of young women I've ever seen, and all very keen on the fire service, having committed a year as being cadets, you know, and they are our future. So obviously we're doing a lot of work at the moment. That's part of the work that Tim's doing as well, people services, about how we translate our fire cadets into trainees. We've got the apprenticeship programme starting soon, so our firefighters will come through as apprentices to encourage that as well. So it encourages actually people can see a learning path and a development path for them. So we're tackling at every single angle we can, so both from local borough levels, and interestingly, I went to a fire station open day during the summer. It was Lewisham Fire Station. It was absolutely, I've never seen such a busy open day, and we had 2 of our firefighters there who volunteered to run a recruitment table, and the list of names that they got for people from the community who were interested in joining as firefighters, the vast majority of whom were from underrepresented groups, was amazing. And it was the big, you know, the encouraging and supporting them to come along to the open days, to the taster days, to be able to talk to serving firefighters, and to be able to look at things like the testing and things and get a real feel for that. So
that was one of the things that I was given some information about, a specific attraction day, where of 266 women who attended, 145 went on to apply to the LFB, which sounds like a pretty high percentage of the people attending. How many of them were successful subsequent to that? Because obviously getting people in and attracting them in the first place, are they getting through the sort of recruitment process, and what work are you able then to do to sort of help them through that process to increase the number of women who are coming in as these new cohorts?
So what we're doing is, in fact, we're taking a step back, because what we want to do is give people the skills and the knowledge before they even get to the application stage. Because by the time they've applied, if it's an issue, for instance, of fitness or strength testing, we need them to have been doing that work beforehand to be able to understand what it is, rather than just try and rush and cram it all in. So as part of the attraction days, what we're doing is giving people, you know, fitness tips, and we're actually working on pairing people up. I know there's some local community initiatives, so Bromley Borough actually ran some days where they got groups of women coming into the fire station together to do fitness training, and then to do some interview practice techniques and things. So there's lots of different areas where people are supporting and encouraging them before the point of application, so they're ready when they actually apply to be able to go through. So when you end up with a group like that, how many of them then do you think would be successful now? So the last assessment day, 45% of the women that attended were successful in getting through, which is a much higher rate than we normally have.
Okay, so that's a real improvement.
Yeah.
And what can you do for the other 55% who've applied and perhaps haven't got through, is there something you can do to support them to go away and do some of the fitness training and so on and so forth you were talking about, so that they can reapply? Is that a
Yes,
possibility?
absolutely, and that's what we're doing. So, you know, the people who come along, because in order even to commit themselves by doing that, by turning up and wanting to apply, they're obviously very keen on it. So we will then give them the additional support, the tips to go away with. There's now a training package that's been produced nationally for fitness and for guidance and support about what you can do to, you know, upper body strength and things. Because a lot of it is that we find is the familiarity with the actual testing techniques themselves. Quite often it isn't the fact that people can't do it, it's just they're not familiar, and where some of it involves operational equipment and things, or even doing things like the shuttle run test, where people aren't familiar with it, then they tend to sort of deselect themselves sometimes, whereas if we can get groups of people together and train and be familiar and be more confident, then that really helps them.
See that Assembly Member Bacon is very upset he wasn't invited to the session in Bromley.
No, I can cope with the disappointment. It's very forward-thinking borough, though, Bromley. I'm not surprised to hear you. Great borough come on. Quick question, though, off the back of that. So some of the questions that Assembly Member Cooper just asked were occurring to me just before she asked them, but one of them is the proportion of women who apply, is it the same proportion who pass? So, for example, if you have 100 people apply and 70 of the men and 30 of the women, the people that get through the application process, is it the same proportion or disproportionately women not getting through?
So in the last rounds we found proportionally we are keeping the level of women who've applied, and that is then represented in the final those who become trainee firefighters.
Right, so it's not a question then of people applying and not realising they're not suitable because of fitness or anything else?
No, so we try and preload a lot of the information we've got online for people to go and deselect themselves if they're not suitable for the role of a firefighter. So when they go onto our website, and obviously our new website's got far more information, it's much easier to access and use now, that people can go on and look at the role of a firefighter, they can answer questions about whether or not they're suitable, they can understand what it really entails. Because I think what we found in the past quite a lot is that people think the role of a firefighter is one thing and the reality of it is entirely different. So we want to make sure that we are, you know, being completely honest with people, that it isn't always about being out the doors and shiny red things and attending fires. A lot of it is about the community safety and the communication skills and the teamwork and making sure people really understand the role before they apply.
So the number of women that apply at the moment, what is roughly the proportion that get offered a job at the end of it?
It varies, doesn't it?
About 12% of our intake is.
Yeah, that's not the question.
That's the numbers, actually.
Because what I'm driving at is if, just take the round numbers that I gave you earlier, if you have 100 applicants, I know you've got more, but let's say you have 100, and 30% of them are women, and you hire 10 people, then 3 of those 10 people will be women. By definition, that means that 70% of your female applicants will fail.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand how many who apply get through, and whether or not there is a common reason why those who don't get through don't get through.
So obviously we look at every single dropout stage as to where people fail at, right across the piece, especially with underrepresented groups. So we look at the failure rates and what it is they fail on to. And I've asked Tim to look specifically at our recruitment process at the moment to see whether any of those are deselecting people they shouldn't deselect. I have some concerns about some of our online testing to make sure that they are selecting the right people, the right skill set, the right values. So at the moment I don't know those numbers, we can get them to you, but that is something I've tasked Tim with doing, is looking at our whole recruitment process to ensure that any of the steps we've got aren't taking people out for no good reason.
Because it's not so much that it's no good reason, it's more if there is something that can be corrected. You gave the example of physical fitness, which is an obvious one. There could be steps that could be taken to make that less of a problem, so you could attract more of the right kind of people who would get through, rather than have people applying and fall by the wayside, if there is a common reason why they fall by the wayside. That's really what I was driving at. So rather than completely reinventing everything, you might just want to refine things a little bit, because there could be one common cause or 2 or 3.
Yeah. And that's why I've asked Tim to look at the data where people are falling out and see whether or not there is something. And it might well just be one part of the testing. You know, we've gone through the evolutions about having qualifications, not having qualifications, and those sorts of things. So, you know, I want to make sure that if there is just one thing that isn't quite right, or is, say, unnaturally deselecting people for no good reason, that we don't do that. So,
presumably, Chair, once Tim has finished a piece of work, we could have a look at that here as well.
Absolutely, I was going to ask for that at the end. Yes, please. That would be interesting. Thank you.
So, some movements towards better levels of women coming in, but we seem to have seen a bit of a decline, unfortunately, in looking at new BAME recruits. It actually fell in 17-18, where it had actually been higher in the previous year. What is that down to, and is there anything that we can transfer over from the better success in terms of bringing more women into this area? Because it's, I mean, you know, London's population is incredibly diverse. You in the brigade are completely missing out on a massive cohort of people if we're not attracting people to even apply in the first place. And maybe that's the problem. Where is the problem here?
Yeah, and I completely agree, and I'll hark back to the fact I look at our fire cadets, and they are fantastically diverse as a group of young people, and they are keen on the idea of being firefighters. So where are we missing the gap between those people and the people who actually apply? So very similar to the piece of research we did about why women don't apply to be firefighters, we are doing a very similar piece of work about BAME people. Obviously, it's a very much wider group, people from very different backgrounds, so we can't apply one thing and say that's going to fit all different categories of people. That would be really wrong. But we are doing that work. We now have our outreach team re-established who are out in our local communities doing that local outreach work, working with local schools, working with careers offices, making sure that, you know, we are in the local communities. I've also tasked all of our borough commanders to ensure they're looking at local attraction and local recruitment, which is why things like the open days have been invaluable for actually getting people to come in through the doors and talking about the role of a firefighter and being able to approach them. And from that we have had a great success of people who've expressed an interest to come into some of our attraction days. We're hoping to, I think, start recruiting again at the beginning of next year. So we're hoping that some of the work we're doing around that will then start to show dividends, but we need to complete this piece of research to find out what there is we can do. But for me, I have the frustration that I look at our fire cadets and they are a brilliantly diverse group of people with a lot of BAME young people, both men and women, and how we translate that into coming to our workforce. Because you're quite right, if we're not attracting from the biggest pool of talent, then we can't possibly be picking the best people to be firefighters.
No, I mean, do you think there are any other initiatives? I mean, you've talked there a bit about local initiatives, specific local initiatives in different areas. If you've got specific, you know, if there are vacancies in, I don't know, clearly there are no vacancies in Bromley because it's so fantastic down there, but there might be in Bexley, who knows? You know, as well. Can you target recruitment into specific areas, because there are clearly different communities that live in different parts of London? Is that something where you can be more specific?
So we would never target somebody to work at a specific fire station, because the whole purpose of London is that we want people to be able to serve anywhere in London. But we do target local communities.
You can target communities that are near.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And we are. That's what the part for me about the local borough commanders, the local station managers actually going out into their local communities, because they know where we've got different groups and different communities, and they're the ones that are then doing, combined with our outreach team, the work into those local communities to ask the question about whether people have thought about the role of a firefighter or what they perceive the barriers might be, to try and get some learning from that.
So do we have any monitoring that shows which of those initiatives might have been more successful in terms of attracting people in who've come through various routes? I think it's very similar to what Assemblymember Bacon was touching on in terms of, as people come through the process, how much it's the sort of granularity level of the monitoring, isn't it, to sort of see, you know, what's being more successful than others, and how do you make sure that you're bringing people in that way? But have you actually got that monitoring? And you know, what about staff also from the European Union, where we might actually now be losing staff? Is that also going to have any kind of impact?
So in fact, I was just talking to Tim earlier on about some work he's doing around looking at our current staff profile and people who in the European Union. But it's very early days for a number of the initiatives we've done, so I think this next round of recruitment will show whether or not those have borne fruit, and we will very closely monitor at what point people found their interest in London Fire Brigade, what it was that attracted them, whether it was a local initiative, whether it was online, whether it was through interface with firefighters. So we do that constantly. Do you want to talk about a bit about the Brexit effect? And
yes, so the Brexit effect, I mean, we have a very small number of staff who are in the European Union, but we do have some. And I think for us it's around...
Staff with an EU nationality.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
With EU nationality. We need to do the piece of work to understand those that would need to apply to remain within the UK, up to the deadline that's been set through the Brexit campaign. And then the conversation for us as an organisation and probably across the wider GLA group is the extent to which we'll support and help those staff go through that process so that they're able to remain in employment. And we don't foresee any real risks around any of that, given the number of staff that we think we've got, which is probably in the ballpark of about 100 staff, we believe, across the brigade.
So
So
that's
it's not a big number.
a very small percentage of staff, so that's not something that's as much of a concern as it is in restaurants where chefs are being lost, or
exactly.
NHS where
nurses,
healthcare, and so on and so forth. Okay, well that's actually very reassuring to hear. And I think you've been commissioning some research in May to better understand barriers. When will we get the to BME communities coming forward? Is that right? And when will we have that data from that, or is that something you'll come back to us?
So I think that's what Dany's already kind of alluded to that's happening at the moment. So the outreach team at the moment are doing some work understanding all of the issues and challenges around some of the BAME issues. I think we understand the gender issues far better than we do the BAME issues, if I'm honest, and I think we need to understand those better. So we're hoping to get that report back fairly soon. As soon as it's available, we'll use that to kind of have a look at where we know there are barriers in terms of first...
Slightly more specific, fairly soon, does that mean...
I don't know the exact date, but we can get that. I don't think it will be next week, but I think it will be the early part of the year.
Okay, so early 2019.
Mm-hmm.
So we might potentially, if you were able to share that with us, we might be looking at some time after that. Thank you.
Very lovely. Andrew?
Yeah, good question. I presume we're not using the residence test anymore for recruits?
It's still currently suspended. I think the term is suspended.
Next question is transfers in and transfers out from other brigades.
Yeah.
What sort of numbers are we looking at there?
We ran a transferring process not that long ago to invite serving firefighters from the UK to apply to join. We took a number of those in. Obviously, there's a balance to be had. It's great to have professional firefighters from other fire and rescue services with different experience. They're obviously fully trained, so they come as a cheaper package, as it were. But there is still the issue that if we're doing that, they are far more likely to be white men than they are to be from diverse backgrounds. So it's a balance about the fact that we wanted to try and make sure that we were working towards achieving our establishment targets, as well as ensuring that we were trying to balance the diversity requirements that we have.
How many?
Did we bring in? I think we brought about 12 or 14 in. It wasn't a huge number.
And how many did we lose to other brigades going the other way?
That's a constant process, so there's a constant coming and going. And recently we've done quite a few middle manager selection process as well, where we've been very successful in attracting applications from other UK fire services as well. So there is a constant toing and froing. I think it's very healthy that people want to work in other fire and rescue services and come back with different experience. I think the people that we see who go out and then come back again to us, come back with a broader understanding of the fire service. So, I think it's a very positive thing that we have an almost transient sort of firefighter and officer workforce around the UK.
You don't know how many left, say, last year to go elsewhere?
No, we can find out for you.
And then on the fire cadets, we still have got boroughs where we don't have a fire cadet programme.
Yeah.
When will we have a fire cadet programme in every borough?
It depends on funding. So we are very dependent on having funding sources to be able to run the fire cadet programme. So having the support of the local borough to do that. So, aspirationally we would like to have one in every borough. That's what we've said. And in some boroughs we'll end up with more than one cadet programme because there is such a popularity for them. We're looking at trying to get a second cadet programme in Tower Hamlets at the moment because it's got such a long waiting list to do it. But I don't know when that comes in because a lot of it is very local funding dependent. So any work that anyone in the Assembly can do to help support us and to get to that local funding would be very grateful.
Well, it would be useful to know how much you want and which boroughs you
we can do that. I can certainly get that information to you. I can get Sarah Prez, our lead for the fire cadets, to find out.
And which boroughs are hard to get?
Definitely, okay, we'll definitely do that. We honestly welcome any support we can with that because they are fantastic.
And the next question is of the transfer. Is this gap between the cadets and applying to join the brigade? What's the age range for cadets?
So our cadets go up to 16, 17, but then we have they transfer and they can become cadet volunteer instructors. So we retain a lot of them who then go on to support the next year of cadets and actually are part of the process as sort of young adult instructors. But if we don't collect them at the point when they leave at sort of 16, 17, we have then got a year or so where we could lose them to other industries, and that's our big gap point where we're trying to work out how to bridge that.
That's what I was going to come to, because the age to join the brigade is 18, is it?
You have to be 18 for the start day. You can apply at 17 and a half, providing you're 18 on the start day when you start training.
So, and the only option at the moment is the cadet instructors.
Yeah. Yeah, so it is working on how we get through that and then how we keep their interest.
So what percentage do you think drop out? Or that's the wrong way of putting it, but I can't think of another way of saying it.
Well, it's hard to know because they don't always say, I definitely want to be a firefighter. They enjoy being a cadet and then they go off and do something else and they've come out. So it's not always easy to work out who we lost, as it were. But it's more important for me about how we have that path for them to stay with us and stay interested. So we have some who come in and work in other areas of the organisation. So we've got 3 or 4 of our cadets who are very keen to become firefighters, but we weren't recruiting at the time. They're now working in headquarters in various roles they've applied for. So a lot of them have the passion and the commitment. They will, do anything to stay in contact. It's about how we make sure that we have the process in place to support them through that kind of gap part.
So do we have, looking at that context, work experience or paid internships or that sort of thing to encourage people?
Apprentices, there's apprentices within the FRS staff. I know that, Dan, you've got some of the former cadets as apprentices, and there's been apprentices in various offices. I know Ron Dobson had an apprentice in his office. So there's that way, and I think that's part of the reason that people felt that actually having an apprentice scheme that would be easier to sort of demonstrate to fire cadets that there was an actual sort of structured qualification route to go through was helpful. And actually I think some of the apprentices come in sort of office roles, and then, as Dany said, they sort of go on and apply to be firefighters. But I think the enthusiasm, I think probably everybody here has met them, the enthusiasm for the brigade from the cadets is quite remarkable, and it's about sort of definitely about how we capture that. And I think the team's very keen to work on that.
I think it's a very, very good initiative. Have we done any comparative work with our cadets compared to who are coming in and joining up, compared to, say, the police cadets or the army cadets in terms of proportions who actually go and join?
I don't know if we have. I can have a look at that, but it'd be interesting to compare that.
Because the police cadet programme has been going a lot longer, and there might be lessons either way to learn about how to bring people on.
And definitely the military ones as well, haven't they? I mean, the military cadets have been going for a long time. Yeah, I was one myself.
Okay.
I was an air cadet.
Before we move on to budget setting, can I just ask you, do many people that go for the life scheme go into the cadets?
Yes, quite often we manage to attract people. Obviously, life is a much shorter scheme, and quite a few of those then have their interest obviously stirred in the fire service, and they then do come in and apply as well. So we get quite a few who, in fact, a number of the ones I spoke to at Old Kent Road had come in through the life course process and then become cadets.
Because I'm mindful just how expensive life is to the brigade.
Yes.
I mean, I've always been a massive supporter, but we didn't have cadets at that stage.
Yeah.
So at some point, is that going to be looked at? Because if you haven't got enough money to fund cadets in every borough, and they are really a positive mood, are you then going to look at the cost of the life programme?
I suppose the life targets different people. So, a lot of our people we target for life courses are young people who might be about to be on the verge of going off the rails in the wrong direction or becoming involved in gangs, who might not necessarily want to be firefighters. So I wouldn't want to say we'd stop doing that, because, they are a different group of people, and we do work alongside. But, it is an expensive commodity, I understand that, but the target group are different, and they are, it is working alongside all of the initiatives around young people and gangs and crimes and knives and all those things. And I think it is a very valuable asset from that point of view.
It is incredible, there's no doubt about that. Okay, can we go on then to the budget, please, Sarah?
Yes, and thank you, Chair. Because it's the budget, I'm not sure it's the same as the Deputy Mayor, the Commissioner or the Director of Finance, so it could be a combination of the three. So the first question is, can you set out the steps involved in the budget setting process this year?
I can start and give you a break. I think in line with previous years, the budget setting process started summer to address the requirements set out in the Mayor's budget guidance. And this has involved a review of the assumption in the medium-term forecast, which is where Sue Budd and her team would have come in, which has included the updated forecast budget gap up to 2022-23. The budget guidance, I understand, was issued to all departments with a request to provide savings to meet their pro rata savings target, so we're still looking for efficiencies across the board. Even though there's no imminent pressure, I think 2022-23 will come around fairly quickly. Alongside this, departments were also invited to submit both bids, with all departmental submissions then reviewed at Directorate boards and the Commissioners Board during August. And then the draft budget proposals are actually going to be reviewed at the Fire and Resilience Board that I'll hold with senior officers next week on the 16th of October, and then we'll drill down into the draft proposals a bit more, and then the budget submission will go back to the Commissioners Board and come back to my board in November before it's submitted by the Commissioner to the Mayor. So the I think there'll be further opportunities. I think we're coming to the plenary and the Budget Performance Committee in December, so we'll have the opportunity to talk in further detail about it.
So you're going to get your whole slot all over again, which I know you're thrilled about, aren't you, Sue? We need to treat you with respect, that's what it's about. Obviously, this is the first year that we've had new governance arrangements. We've had a Deputy Mayor instead of our FIPA. Has that generated change in the process?
I think probably, I think we talked a bit about this in May at the first meeting. One of the things that we don't have anymore is obviously we don't have the committee structure. And I think one of the benefits of committees is that you have different individuals there who spot different things in a spreadsheet, or spot different things, or sort of ask things from a slightly different perspective. So what I've tried to do is try to replicate that through the type of questions I've been asking at the meetings I've been having periodically with senior staff, and at the more formal meeting at the board meeting, to just try and make sure that we still have that type of rigour. And I would say actually that the meetings we have with the GLA, with David Bellamy and David Galley, are actually pretty rigorous in terms of the questioning of Sue Budd and her team, myself and the Commissioner, in terms of the sort of performance, but also future budget proposals.
Okay, so forecasting forward from today, what issues do you expect to unearth in the budget setting process, if any?
I think we've got a few unknowns. We've got a pensions issue coming round the corner from government, which we don't know how big that will be. I mean, I don't know, Sue, whether you can come in on that.
So the government has recently announced that it knows now the outcome of the actuarial evaluation of the firefighters' pension scheme, but it hasn't told us what that is. So you may remember from previous budget rounds, we'd assumed just short of 9 million as a combination of all the pensions pressures we thought would be reflected in that valuation. They've said that they're going to change the discount rate again, which would put further pressure onto that. They're looking at the cost cap. They're saying that the cost of the scheme is lower than they had promised it would be. So in theory, that should result in increased pension benefits potentially for the members of the scheme. So they need to look at how they've managed that. They're also looking at the Milne versus GAD. I don't remember that case around how commutation factors had not been uplifted over this certain period of time. And that it was a particular case. It was Milne versus GAD, and it had come to light, I think, between 1998 and 2006. Commutation factors hadn't been uplifted, so there's some retrospective application of that required. So they're the three things they've mentioned. They haven't mentioned the retained firefighters, which you may remember from before, we thought would come our way. So we just don't know at the moment what this is going to mean. Pessimistically, we think that maybe our just short of 9 million pressure that we've included might be a bit light now. But we don't know how much of, maybe if the retained's not reflected, how much that would bail us out. So our understanding is that this goes through the Scheme Advisory Board, and then for the firefighter scheme, and then eventually we'll get some sort of results, and hopefully it'll be in time for us to take into account.
Yeah. Have you had an indication of time scale on that?
They sort of said a couple of weeks in their announcement a couple of weeks ago, but I've not heard any more since.
So today then? Right, okay. You've got an underspend again this year, which is not a new event for the Fire Brigade. This year around about 7 million, and I gather that slightly over half of that is related to vacancies, staffing vacancies, which again is not a new occurrence. Why do you think that is this time? I mean, is it making assumptions about people across all grades, or what's the cause?
We had, last year, we call it the vacancy margin, which is the factor we take into account how many vacancies we'll have, and we take that money out. And we did some of that, but we didn't reflect it all, which was part of our strategy around building this budget flexibility reserve. But the other thing we didn't understand at that time is when you don't have the people in post, you do then have an overtime pressure. So the 7 million underspend that you saw as at the end of June, we feel that is potentially going to come down quite significantly as a result of the additional overtime costs that we're now seeing played through. We haven't got those numbers, but that's the risks to that underspend that you've seen would be that MFB income as usual, and also some stuff around building maintenance costs. So I don't want to put my fingers down now and say that will be my outturn, that's £7 million.
When will you know?
Well, we do it every month and every quarter, so we try and get a best figure every time, but I'm hoping that by the end of September figure could be clearer for us.
I mean, obviously if you had to choose, an underspend is distinctly preferable to an overspend, but nevertheless there's an opportunity cost to underspend, isn't there? And if it is related to recruitment, and this sort of relates to some of the questions that Assemblyman McCoop was asking a moment ago, what action is the brigade taking, if any, to realign recruitment so that we don't end up with annual underspends, particularly on the area? Because when they used to be very large, didn't they, the underspends, and they've been whittled down over the years. This is probably the smallest it's been for some time, but nevertheless it is a significant number in your overall budget. So the bits that are related to recruitment, what action are you taking to change that?
So what we've done is we've obviously spoken to our training provider Babcock's. We've increased each course by 2, so there are 2 additional trainee firefighters. We've also bought a number of courses to be run at the Fire Service College to increase our establishment, and we are on target to have our establishment complete by June 2019 with the additional courses we are running and additional places on courses.
Has the less than hoped for level of recruitment over time led to any operational impediment to the brigade, or is it covered, as Sue's just indicated, has it been recovered by overtime?
Yeah, so it is recovered by overtime, which is obviously not the way we want to run it, because it is more expensive, but we have filled those spaces with overtime, and it hasn't seen an impact on our frontline availability. There have been occasions across the summer, obviously impacted by sickness as well, where we have had far more numbers of people not available for work. But the increase in the ramp up in the recruitment rate now is starting to pay dividends on fire stations. We've also got, one of the issues we've got is a shortage of crew managers. So we've got people acting up from the firefighter role into the crew manager role, which once again takes people off being frontline firefighters. So we're addressing that as well. So it's about making sure we've got the right level of crew manager development courses available and the right level of selection process to fill those vacancies, which then stops this having this sort of temporary promotion chain, which also causes problems for the frontline firefighters.
Okay. When you do come in front of the Budget Committee in December, is this an area that you think you'll be able to talk a lot more definitively about?
Yeah, in December, yeah, when we'll have our end of Q2 figures, we'll be further along with the recruitment process, and we'll have to set out what we're assuming around a vacancy margin for next year, so I would expect that to be an area of discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Well, before I go on to my own, just on that, I heard on the grapevine, going around talking to people, that we've had pumps off the run due to staff shortages, and up to about 10 or more. Is that right?
Yeah, so those specifically across the summer periods with the increased sickness as well, and that whole thing feeds back to that issue around if people can't take leave because they haven't got enough people, that people then subsequently go sick, which then causes even more of a shortfall. You get people to come in on overtime, but you can't force them to do that. So we have had issues where we have had up to 10 frontline appliances off the run. Fortunately, that hasn't impacted on any of our ability to respond. We have a strategic cover fire model which we run every time, so that if there are stations that haven't got a pump on the run, then we have stations coming in standby. So we maintain that level of fire cover, and we run that model regularly throughout the day at control to ensure we have resources in the right places.
And when you talk about overtime, you mean that people are coming in for a full shift?
Yes.
On overtime?
Yes, that's right.
On one of their days off?
Yes.
Presumably not between the night shifts?
No. No, we have very strict rules about which days they can come in and work.
Okay.
Gareth wanted
Yeah, sorry, a question that I should really have asked earlier. How under strength is the brigade? So how many vacancies are you currently carrying?
183.
Okay, and the strength at the moment is about, what, 4,500?
Yeah.
Okay. So as a percentage, it's not massive, but it's... No. You could clear that in one recruitment round, couldn't you?
We could. So if the recruitment we've got planned now with the courses we've got planned, we'll fill that.
Obviously, you've also got people leaving, and that's been something that's been harder to predict because obviously, when people come towards retirement, they've got the week's notice period, so that's made it quite hard to predict. So. I'm not quite sure. You probably do have an estimate of how many people you need to...
That's all factored into the plan that we've done to give us assurance at the moment that we'll be at full establishment by June 2019.
How much notice do you get? Because there's no real reason for anyone to be secretive about their intention to retire, is there? Most people look forward to retiring and you can predict reasonably accurately.
No, that unfortunately isn't always the case. So there are things at the moment that are impacting on it, not least of all the uncertainty around issues. You'll have seen conversations around the firefighters' pay and whether or not the unions talking about whether or not steps need to be taken, and people, there are all a number of factors where people will suddenly think, no, now's the time for me to go. People anxieties, around things like whether or not there'll be any changes to pension regulations, whether or not, there'll be any changes to the amount people take as a commutation. So although you would think that you could predict accurately when people are going to go once they've done their time, so we get people who will go at 30 years and we'll get others who will stay for 35 years. So it isn't always, so we know the people who can go, but they don't always go in a predicted way, and they don't always give us, some people are, obviously very considerate and give us, couple of months' notice of their intention to leave. Other people do it with a week's notice.
So those who are approaching the minimum level required, presumably all of them, you know who they are. Yeah. Do you stay close to them and sort of keep in regular contact about their intentions?
No, we
don't. You don't
ask.
want to chase them out, but
no, I think that people would feel a bit harassed if we said when you're going. It might look like you're trying to get rid of them.
You might actually come on start with
please stay.
And I think that people, and if you say please stay, then people think, well, you asked me to stay, and they become suspicious. So I think generally, people on watches talk about and have conversations around it, but we don't do any kind of central monitoring on it. And talking about whether people are going to go. And we also get the factor, of course, that when people reach a certain age, but they haven't necessarily done their time, then they can go on reduced levels. So there are a number of different things. And there are people, we've got somebody who's next year about to have served 50 years as an operational firefighter. So we do get 50 years. He joined the year I was born.
What kind of medal do you get for that? I mean, that's 2.5 good service.
Must be something quite special.
Something very special. So, we do have extremes at either end of it. And then
50 years as an operational firefighter?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
It's amazing. Absolutely
the brigade
amazing.
Needs to do something significant.
Oh, yeah, massively. We've got some plans. But that is the sort of extremes of it.
Bag now.
I think Gareth wants to come to the party.
But so we do have very different.
Some people seem to think, I want to spend all my time going to parties. Not entirely, but that needs to be marked up. Thank you very much.
Well, just looking at that, I mean, there's been some kickback about increasing the pension age to 60. Has that started to bite?
Not yet, we haven't seen any of that, but obviously one of the things we are doing very proactively is looking at health monitoring of older firefighters, because there have been concerns raised about people in their 50s and fitness and ability to carry on working, so we are doing a specific piece of work around that to ensure that we're not only monitoring those people but doing some proactive work around health and well-being for them.
And you might remember, actually, I think it might have been at the last LFIPA Resources Committee, we had a breakdown based on age of sickness. So I think that is something that the sickness absences did increase in sort of the firefighters decade by decade. Yeah.
It's not surprising, really.
No, it's not.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. We're now, I'm mindful of time as well. We're going on to the fire safety post-Grenfell Tower Fire update. And Andrew's going to be asking questions.
Yes. I'll try not to stray into areas that are the preserve of the inquiry, but presumably there have been changes since Grenfell that you would do anyway, either because of obvious experience from Grenfell or things that have come through since. What sort of things have you changed since Grenfell?
So obviously we are looking at a number of areas, and it's no secret to have seen the areas that are coming up as part of the inquiry. And one of the things that we've been asked to do is to provide a report at the end of phase 1 to the inquiry about actions and steps we've taken. What we won't do, and what we've said absolutely won't do, is knee-jerk to anything. So we'll make sure that we need to fully understand exactly what happened on the night, the details of that, before we make any changes, because it's very important to have the whole picture for that. We've just completed up till 0400 hours now of the understanding of the operational response on the night, looking at the factors involved in that. We obviously at that point you then have to look at operational policies before you start changing anything else to see whether or not we need to do revisions of that, and that's an ongoing process at the moment. What we have is, as part of our own internal investigation team, where things come to light, they then discuss that with the relevant head of that area of work, whether it be operational policy, whether it be anything else, to then have a conversation around what steps we need to look at, and we're taking involved in that. But obviously a lot of that is going to be subject to the report that will be submitted to the chair of the inquiry in due course. So I can't go into a lot of the specifics of the details around that. One of the things that we are going to do is to undertake a fundamental piece of work looking at our training to ensure that that's fit for purpose, and looking at training going forward into the future, because that's obviously a very important component, part of not only the response for our firefighters but right across the piece for our officers, control staff and everybody. So that's very important to me, is to make sure that we are learning and we are doing what we can to develop and train for the future, to make sure our firefighters are, match fit, professional and safe for the future in every aspect. So there's a whole range of different pieces of work, and that combined with the work obviously that Dan Daly and his team are doing around the fire safety and the actual buildings we've got that we know about in London. So there are several pieces of work that we're undertaking, but for me it is really important that we make sure we do them in a timely fashion, and we make sure we do them in a manner that responds to absolute facts, not just to knee-jerking to individual comments.
If I can add that the review of the provision of training that the Commissioner mentioned is going to be an independent review, so it'll have that sort of more objective perspective, and also from the point of view of making sure we have an objective view about some of these things. Obviously Steve Apter is relatively new to the brigade and is responsible for training, so it sort of gives that added perspective of objectivity to that particular area.
So when you say it's been done independently, do you mean by another chief officer or?
We're currently in the stage at the moment of going out to procurement process to find somebody to undertake that. So we've written what we believe to be the outlines or specification of what we would like to be looked at. We're then going to procure somebody to come and do that process for us. But it needs to be somebody who understands fire and rescue service training and outside of London, to give it that proper level of scrutiny for me.
Can we see that document, or is it private?
It's not been published yet. As soon as it's available, we will share it with you.
Thank you. And will you be looking at stay put as well, or? No,
stay put isn't London Fire Brigade policy. It's national government policy, so no, we won't be looking at that.
Okay. Looking at cladding on existing buildings, what progress is being made in relation to dealing with that?
So I'll pass over to Dan to do the details. He has it in his head. I have the better outline figures, but obviously Dan has photos far close to that. Can I ask you to progress that? Thank you.
So we're still progressing well with the work. I think we updated this board last time round. So we're still working very closely with London councils, working with our primary authority partners where they are affected. Currently we are in the region of 1,100 audits carried out. Around about 400 of those buildings are private. I think there was a question asked last time. So we have moved on significantly since that point. There's been some clarification recently from government around what the removal of cladding means, which is not unhelpful. Certainly when it comes to partial clad buildings, that's a useful piece of clarification, and certainly supports the position that we've taken and the advice we've given to building owners. We are still working with the potential of a joint task force. There's been funding agreed for that, but it hasn't actually moved forward yet with London councils, where they may seek the support of our fire engineers to help determine those buildings where action hasn't yet been taken, but we'd like to do some of that. That also requires movement in the Housing Act and how local authorities can apply their legislation to compel building owners to engage with the process. So I think it's a positive and moving story. We still have a number of buildings that have simultaneous evacuation strategies in place. Currently there are 127 buildings now in London as a result of ACM cladding that have simultaneous evacuations in place. 85 of those are private buildings, 42 are local authority or housing association buildings. There are some other buildings, taking the number up to 152 in total, where they have simultaneous evacuation, but that's not as a result of ACM cladding, that's a result of other fire safety related issues that have come to light in the post-Grenfell era, and as a result of the more intrusive work that our fire safety officers are undertaking.
So, just trying to get into that in a bit more detail. It's not just the cladding stuff. We've heard the stories about fire doors not being fitted properly or not performing as they're supposed to do. Are we affected by that, and if so, by how many?
So we have been notified of a number of, a specific type of door was found to be not performing as it should under test conditions. And we've been notified of a number of those doors where they exist in London. I don't have the numbers of those at the moment because it's a moving feast. We're getting new notifications each day. We actually supported the NFCC and the expert panel in determining the risk assessment for the impacts of those on public safety. Generally, because fire doors are something that can suffer mechanical damage, they interact with humans, they can be wedged, the closures be removed. They aren't something that necessarily we rely on to support. We certainly don't sit at fire stations assuming we have half hours before we get going. So it is a relatively low risk in terms of what it provides to people, but nonetheless it's a risk area that we are working with building owners to get them to undertake a programme of replacement where we know we have those doors in place. In terms of the specifics around the inquiry and what they're looking at in terms of passive fire protection, I won't stray into those because there are specific sets of dynamics in play at that instant will affect the performance of materials.
Well, certainly on fire doors, I recall a few years ago visiting one of the tower blocks in my constituency after it had been redecorated, and the contractors had put the closures on back to front, so it pushed the doors open instead of closed, which was very helpful. I got that sorted out pretty quickly. Going back to simultaneous evacuation and so forth, some of those are going to be private blocks, some are going to be council stroke housing association. Are you satisfied that action's being taken by the owners in relation to trying to perhaps prioritise those over the ones that don't need simultaneous evacuation?
Yeah, I think one of the pieces of clarification we were looking for in the government guidance was that whilst we welcome that clarification, that we are still working very closely, and they follow the advice of Fire and Rescue Services around the prioritisation of those buildings to be remediated. The presence and the location of the ACM cladding and its interaction with means of escape will affect the level of risk it poses to people in that building. So whilst the clarification says let's remove ACM regardless of the quantity in which it's involved in a building, we are still very much advising people to look to their Fire and Rescue Services for some advice around how to prioritise those buildings. Okay,
and one of the issues that cropped up at the time, and presume still applies, is the capacity of the building trade to actually do this work. Can you give any insights into that?
I think there is still a pressure to what extent it's affecting people or holding people up in their efforts to remediate buildings. I couldn't tell you. I think there is still a further piece of work that would be welcome, and that's the clarification under the new building regs of exactly what people should be putting onto buildings when they are remediating. And that clarification isn't yet coming out, so we have seen and we are consulting on at the moment the early changes to the building regulations. However, the initial clarification that's been put into that is more around the style and content and presentation of the information. It doesn't actually deal with the technical detail that really gets to the bottom of the problem around cladding and building facades. So that's something we'll still campaign and push for to get that clarification as soon as possible.
And at the last committee we heard from the RICS, wasn't it, about the potential number of buildings there are that may not yet have even been identified. To what extent do you think you've got into identifying all the potential tower blocks in the capital, and to what extent do you think there might be others that we don't know about?
I think it's still a concern. When I sat before this committee, I think we'd seen about 100 private buildings last time out. We're now up to about 400, so as I say, it is an improving picture, but undoubtedly there are still buildings. I would suspect the number of private buildings would exceed those that are under local authority control, and we're not in that region yet, so I still suspect there is some work to do. But I think it's important that we still target those buildings that potentially have the risk to simply blanket all buildings and use what limited resources we have, tackling what may potentially doesn't offer any risk to residents would be a bad move. I think the joint inspection task force that was proposed may well be a way forward, and so we're keen to see that get off the ground as soon as possible.
And to what extent I'll be looking at non-residential buildings like NHS, office blocks and so forth?
Yeah. So NHS buildings were part of the initial tranche, as you know, so I think we looked at about 44 NHS buildings that were affected, and we've given advice and worked through the issues with those people. We also have student accommodation, which is something that comes within this, and there's a number of those.
Yeah, so there was a big fire yesterday in Silverton, wasn't there?
There was, yes, over in Brunel University buildings. I think one of the bits around the commercial side, there are different considerations in terms of those buildings, in terms of the evacuation strategy, the way those buildings are designed to be evacuated in the event of a fire. I certainly wouldn't be pushing for those commercial buildings which present a much lower risk to life. You know, we don't see people dying in commercial buildings. I wouldn't want them to be entering the issue at the moment and putting further pressure on that supply chain and taking the focus away from where we believe there is a real risk to people and to residents.
Okay. And coming back to equipment procurement, can you give us an update on where we've got to with that? And I presume the money's still there.
Yes, so the aerials, I'm expecting a paper to come to my London Fire Commissioners Board next month. So we have a preferred bidder from the process. We've got some technical clarification going on at the moment. So we hope that we will see the paper next... Oh no, October, it's this month. We're in October now already, crikey. This month to seal that and have the order going for the extended height aerials. EDBA, that's aware a longer term process. But in the meantime, we are looking at different issues around whether we can get EDBA to the fire ground in a different way in the meantime, and whether or not there's any benefit in changing some of the predetermined attendance for our fire rescue units to ensure that EDBA is on the fire ground, in a quicker time frame. So we're looking at those, but that's unlikely to see any fruition until 2021. That's obviously a far larger scale project.
Is that because it has to be designed, or? Yeah,
there's obviously it's about going out to ensure. So for the EDBA is quite an interesting one because obviously with new technologies and lighter breathing apparatus sets, you can have greatly extended duration, but that has to compare against the physiological impact on firefighters and the welfare for that. So, our firefighters obviously aren't robots. We can't have them going into, superheated things for hours on end. We've done a lot of work around physiological impact on firefighters, so it's about the balance and ensuring we have the right equipment, but that we don't overstress our firefighters in using that. But it is about going out to the market and looking at the technology that's there now, and ensuring we get the right breathing apparatus set to balance that. Very pleased.
It's going to take for another 3 years to do that.
That's till we actually have them delivered. So that is the length of time it takes to procure a breathing apparatus, unfortunately. Very pleased to say we have our trial drones on the run now, and they've been out about 5 or 6 times already, operationally to incidents. We've got 2 different types of drone at the moment. They've been out and they've already shown some absolute positives. So we used one of them at a large fire in a school where we believed there to be cylinders on the roof, and obviously if there's cylinders involved in fire we have to have a cordon zone, but we quickly found out it was actually fire extinguishers on the roof, not cylinders, so we were able to commit crews into the building. We've had other ones in property fires where we've been able to use it to locate hotspots that you can't see even with using aerial appliances. So we found some really positive situations already, and we've only had them on the run for about a week, and they've been out regularly. So we've got a unit with a screen, so the incident commander can have a look and get instant sort of download from the drone footage to be able to make assessments and use them as part of the sort of risk assessment for how we tackle the fire and what we do. So I'm very pleased that they're already on the run and already paying great dividends, and I think that we'll see a multitude of uses, not least of all for things like water rescue and line rescue, and where we always have great support from the police air support unit. Obviously it takes a while to get there, and if it's engaged in another operation we can't have it. So having our own drones available, we have 6 pilots currently licensed in London Fire Brigade who are in a blue light van able to turn out to operational incidents 24/7. So that's a really welcome response. The escapers, we will very soon become one of the first fire and rescue service in the UK to have escape hoods available on our frontline pumping appliances. So that will be coming up very soon. I'm very pleased about that because that's obviously a really very new technology that we've been looking at. On the whole, I think that we are making very good progress with the list of new equipment, and I'm very pleased with the what we've done so far.
And what about communications? Is that all going to be dependent on the ESN, or
No, so the breathing apparatus communications, that will be part of the breathing apparatus replacement programme. That won't be dependent on ESN. That will be, and one of the interesting things about that is the new technologies mean it'll be cableless communications. At the moment, currently our breathing apparatus communications have wires running across them, which make them very cumbersome and difficult. So the new Bluetooth technology means that those will be a much better place for our firefighters and much less cumbersome. But that isn't a requirement on the ESN project.
Where we've got to in hiring the 27 fire safety inspection officers.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity once again to clarify what the ask was, Andrew, because I think we did this last time round. And actually the ask was around resources to enhance the fire safety inspection programme, and we've made significant progress with that. So we've been able to use those resources to put in place some quality assurance, some training and policy improvements within the fire safety department to support the work of our IOs. We've managed in that period to move 20 IOs through development into competence, and the remaining 10 that we have a pathway and will shortly be achieving that same level. That will then enable us to start to recruit back up to our establishment numbers in the inspecting officer arena. Because prior to that we had officers being supported in their development through other officers that were on development. That's not ideal, it's not where we want to be for professional service. So I think we've been able to use that very well at the moment. I think we're looking at the fire engineering team and improving the resilience within that. The ask and the commitment of that team has been significant over this particular period, not just supporting the work that we have to do day to day, but also the work to shape the future of building regulations and the whole regime that potentially led us to where we were in June of last year. So I think it's been a useful addition into the department, and I think it is something that I certainly look back on the work of that department. There was lots mentioned earlier, but a lot of FRS members of staff working at a considerable rate of effort for a considerable length of time, and I think it's to be commended, the work that they've actually undertaken over the last year or so.
And last issue from me, London Safety Plan, is it the intention to revisit it in the light of experience?
Well, obviously we monitor our commitments against the London Safety Plan. There are things we've had a conversation around that at the moment we wouldn't seek to be doing, so of course we will do that, and in light of any findings that come out from the inquiry, we will look at some things we've proposed and decide whether or not they are suitable at this moment in time. But we do monitor ourselves against the commitments anyway, and you know, it would be remiss of us not to look at any findings we have and measure ourselves against those as part of the London Safety Plan.
Well, I don't expect that. Are we expecting some sort of supplement to it, or are we just going to leave it and the bits we're just not going to do?
So I think that we will, you know, I'm not planning on a wholesale review of it and a supplementary to it, because a lot of them were proposals. I don't think any of the things that we've talked about that we're definitely going to do will change, but some of the proposals in some of the alternative crewing we're looking differently at the moment, but those are things that we undertook to do projects on and look at and review anyway, so we'll do that as part of that process.
Okay, well, lots of good news, and of course we are very happy that the Secretary of State has banned the use of combustible cladding. That was really good over new residential buildings over 18 metres, so we're all very happy about that. Bexley Boy, yes.
It's 18 metres too. But is 18
Anyway.
metres too short or too tall?
I think
It's just about right, isn't it?
I think on a serious note, there is an issue with it being quite so specific, because what happens to those buildings that are just under 18 metres?
17 and a
Because
half.
the Commissioner and I spoke to a firefighter who was actually living in a building that was just short of 18 metres in a complex where there were several other buildings that measured over 18 metres. And the question is, what should happen to those blocks? And I think there needs to be some flexibility in how that's approached, because if you were to get a situation in which a flower bed sort of rose by 5 centimetres, you could quite easily anecdotally, you could quite easily get buildings that sort of were suddenly sort of below a height or over a height. So I think there does need to be some flexibility in the favour of those residents, so that you don't get buildings that are just under or sort of at a... and I think in Scotland it's 11 metres, for example, which is sort of well under. So I think you do need to take into account that sort of what happens to those people where it's 5 centimetres under.
Okay, well, we'll make sure that message goes through.
Yeah,
thank you. But nevertheless, we
no, it's very welcome, I agree.
But do we think 18 is the right threshold as compared to Scotland, for example?
Well, I've been involved in the Local Government Association submission on it, where we did come down to saying we should have a sort of national standard and go for 11, but I think there's probably a slightly different view from the brigade.
Okay, perhaps we can take this
Yeah.
to another meeting.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of the time. Okay, we're now going on to sprinklers, please, and Leonie's going to lead on this.
We might return to this issue about height and when they should be fitted and so on and so forth, because there's lots of different decisions being made. But I thought perhaps if we started with, if you could actually set out what are the comparative benefits of sprinklers, automated fire suppression systems, in comparison to other forms of retrofitted fire retardant systems. I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so obviously London Fire Brigade has been massive advocates for sprinklers and fire suppression systems for a very long time as a package of fire safety measures. We obviously recognise the benefits they play in, reducing the massive impact that fires can have, not only on people there but local communities. We can all recognise that the vast majority of fires are extinguished by those means before we even get called. And therefore, not only does it limit the damage to the building, it limits water damage, which limits environmental damage. It actually removes the risk to people living or working in those properties. It removes the risk to firefighters going and tackling those blazes. So for us, if you look at the comparison of putting a fire out by regular means and one out by sprinklers, there's a 90% less water usage where the sprinkler puts a fire out than if we have to do it by regular means. So, I think the talking about the benefits of sprinklers, they are such an important, they play such an important role as part of fire safety measures for us. And we think this campaigning, we urge now that following on from the Dame Judith Hackett review, that these, recommendations are acted upon, because we know that sprinklers do save lives, but also, for me, it is places, where you have vulnerable people, where you have young people. So the impact on sprinkler systems in schools, if you look at the...
I'm going to come on to schools and care homes and sort of the lower rise facilities in a moment, but I just wondered if I could unpick a little bit of what you said. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the London Assembly have been discussing sprinklers, and I think we're pretty strong advocates of their use as well, having done a report after the 2009 Larkanel fire into this area. Can you just say whether you think the sprinklers... it's okay just to fit them inside people's flats? Should they be fitted in the common parts? Are they better in the common parts? Are they better in people's flats? And is there really any difference between a building that is 10 stories high and a local authority, for example, deciding it must fit sprinklers if the building is 10 stories high? What happens to very similar to what the Deputy Mayor was just saying, what happens to the people who live on the 9th floor of a block that finishes at 9 floors? Could you just unpack that a bit about height and also the location of sprinklers?
So, I'm not a sprinkler expert, I don't pretend to be one. We do advocate the benefits of sprinklers for residential accommodation. Fires predominantly, with the exception of bin rooms, don't normally start in communal parts in premises. They do generally start inside people's compartments of origin, so kitchens, bedrooms, places where people smoke. So obviously the benefit is to having the sprinkler placed where the fire is more liable to start, because that's the point it can extinguish it. Have not been part of a conversation about heights of buildings where sprinklers should be fitted. For me, they are about the benefits in extinguishing fires and saving lives. I think that having them in residential accommodation is vital, and especially accommodation where vulnerable people are.
So for you, the height would be irrelevant. It's just that I sat here only last week and we had representatives of 4 of the largest housing associations operating across London were visiting us as guests for the Housing Committee, and I specifically asked them all the question about sprinklers because that was one of the areas we were discussing with them, and they all said they're planning to install sprinklers in common parts, but in common parts only.
No, that's not something we're aware of. If I could just... We often talk about sprinklers in terms of life safety. The fact that we don't see sprinklers widely fitted in residential accommodation is no surprise that it's hard to track their ability to save lives, but undoubtedly they tackle a fire at its earliest stage and can only be a useful addition to a full package of fire safety measures. They shouldn't be seen as a silver bullet in any way, shape or form. We are very much advocating a people-centred risk assessment approach. So looking at the use of the buildings, the type of people that reside there, and the issues affecting their vulnerability and propensity to fire, and using that as part of your decision-making process around where sprinklers should be fitted. So we've certainly advocated a lower threshold than the 30 metres currently for new builds. We're looking at 18 metres. We think that buildings should be retrofitted to 18 metres in line with where we currently stand.
But you would encourage that inside the individual flats?
But absolutely inside, as the Commissioner's pointed out, we don't see, particularly where common parts are policed by the RRO and are generally sterile areas, you don't see many fires in communal areas. They tend to start in people's flats, and that's where the risk is. In a similar way that we've advocated fire alarms being fitted in all rooms of risk, it's about understanding where fires start and where people get the earliest warning, and in the case of sprinklers, where they'll be effective at the earliest stage of fire development.
Okay, well, I mean, all of that material is available because it was a webcast meeting, so I can easily share with you who they were, but that is their plan, and I asked all 4 of them, and they're not planning to install them in people's flats. But then that does come on to the slightly thorny issue about who pays for it, because in common parts, all those associations were all saying they were going to pay for the sprinklers. But of course, if you make an installation inside somebody's flat, there is an issue as to whether or not the landlord who owns the building pays for that, or whether the occupants should pay for it, particularly if they're leaseholders or shared owners. What do you think of the idea of, from the planning committee, our planning committee, not our housing committee, who recommended that the mayor should set up a £50 million London sprinkler retrofitting fund so that, you know, we can assist people in those circumstances, because many people might not feel that they've got, you know, the £2,000, the £3,000 or the £4,000 to pay to fit sprinklers, and then, you know, sort out all the issues with the decoration having been damaged with the fitting.
If I can come in on this, I think Assemblymember Shah's having a meeting with the Mayor's office next week to discuss the findings of his report. So I think it might be slightly unreasonable to expect Dan Daly to anticipate that or comment on that before that meeting happens.
Okay, because that was to be targeted at 200 high-risk dwellings, however they're defined. And so just to unpack what you were saying about doing it on a fire risk assessment basis, obviously the occupants of a building, it's very significant, but also you were saying, does it relate to the building type as well? So if there are 2 staircases to enable people to escape, is that being considered as part of the matrix in doing the fire assessment? Or the building material?
Yeah, the fire risk assessment is multi-layered. It's not about one solution in any given circumstance. Where I talked about people-centred risk assessments, one of the reasons why we've talked about care homes and specialised housing and looking for regulation around the installation of sprinklers in those buildings, because there are vulnerabilities and propensity to fire for those individuals which place them at high risk, undoubtedly. So I wouldn't turn around and say you've got 2 staircases, you don't need sprinklers. It's much more layered than that. And I certainly wouldn't sit here and actually give this panel or any other advice that would say, yeah, I can give you a desktop review of where sprinklers would be beneficial. It's very much about the building, and what we're trying to push much harder is around the types of people that live, reside, visit and work in those places.
Because I've had some discussion with residents who've been told that the local authority would like to fit sprinklers, but they've also got a fire risk assessment carried out both pre-Grenfell and post-Grenfell that says, because you've got the building construction is concrete and you've got 2 staircases, and it's not particularly, you know, it's maybe 12 stories high, you know, you don't necessarily need sprinklers. That could be the case then from,
absolutely.
From a fire risk assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be the outcome of the fire risk assessment. It doesn't necessarily make that fire risk assessment wrong. What you need to know from our perspective is more about the people that live there, and does that assessment take care of the needs of every individual in that building. So we're seeing lots more vulnerable people being housed in their own homes with assisted and adaptations to their home. So there are things like personal protective systems that we've been championing. We actually funded through a Community Safety Investment Fund a number of those projects to look at the effectiveness of those, where you can provide a more bespoke solution, if you like, to vulnerable people living in a general purpose accommodation block.
So in terms of the Deputy Mayor was just telling us about the forthcoming discussion between the Mayor and the Chair of the Assembly's Planning Committee. The Mayor has also said that he would be lobbying government about making sure that there might be more money coming from government towards a London retrofitting fund for sprinklers. Is there any news on that you're aware of, or is that...
I don't think there's been any funding forthcoming from government on that.
Oh, that's a shame. I'm sure when Grenfell had just happened, I thought they said there would be.
I don't think there has been.
Okay. And could you tell us a bit more, and this is probably back to the Fire Brigade rather than the Deputy Mayor, you were talking about the need for doing those assessments about individuals who are particularly vulnerable. Could you talk a bit more about what you've been doing to promote the fitting and use of sprinklers in care homes, sheltered housing, and I think we've also mentioned schools, because obviously that's another concern.
Are you asking me, or did you say?
So it's obviously something that we fully support the position statement about fitting them in all care homes and specialised housing, and we did a lot of media activity in March this year to promote that. We know that only 1% of care homes and retirement homes, residential hostels that we're called to have sprinklers fitted in them. Of the 428 fires at hostels, care homes, retirement homes and shelter housing accommodation in 2017, there were sprinklers installed in just 5 of them, and 3 of those fires were fatalities and a further 53 people were injured. So quite stark statistics about people suffering as a result of places that don't have sprinklers fitted. We've already had 69 fires in 2018 in those types of buildings so far. Obviously it presents a much more serious challenge to people in those types of properties who may be bedridden, unable to leave if they're in a fire situation. So that's why we think it's so vitally important for those people specifically to have that additional support by having those sprinkler systems fitted. And Dan said quite rightly, as part of the work we did about having the individual portable sprinkler type systems, where we were able to recognise individual vulnerable people who were in normal housing, to actually be able to protect them and make them safe, because if you are somebody and people have perfectly rights and choices, they wish to smoke and things, but if you are bedridden or chair bound and can't get up and you do smoke and set light to yourself, that's the worst thing ever. So you want somebody to have the ability to have that fire extinguished and the means of alerting other people to it. So we are very strong advocates of that happening and retrofitting into those types of premises.
So do you think there's anything else that could be done to move this forward? Because 1% sounds very low, and if there were only 5 premises where sprinklers were fitted out of 428 where fires took place in 2017, that's really quite a low figure out of that number of premises. And a lot of these places are going to be places where there's multiple dwellings as well. So that as you say, that could involve a large number of people. What else can we do to persuade care home managers to fit?
So I think one of the mistakes some mistakes certainly in my eyes, is people look to the cost of sprinkler installations and the value and how many lives have been saved by that. And as I said, there's low uptake of sprinkler installations where people live. What people fail to look at is the other issues, that the damage to communities when it's schools, the vulnerability of individuals that are affected in certain care homes, specialised housing accommodation, the effect on families, the non-availability of that social asset for a period of time. It's a much wider ranging suite of benefits that sprinklers will help to limit damage to and make available to others in the community. So it's those encouraging that kind of thinking more broadly than simply talking about how much it would cost and how many lives might potentially be saved. It's a really crude analysis to simply think about it in terms of life safety. It's a much bigger piece than that.
Thank you very much. That's the end of mine. I think we'll pass over to
Anne. Well, just coming back onto schools, we saw in 2017 school fires increased in number from 67 the year before to 90. Has that trend continued, and what's behind it?
So I haven't got the statistics to hand. I do know that we had a very large school fire just for the return to school this term in September, where a school was under renovation, and it completely destroyed a large area of that school, of a building that had been renovated without sprinklers in, meaning that school could not return, and the displacement of all the students from that school and the impact on the local community from that point of view. We can get those figures for you, but I'm not sure if that's a continuing trend.
What do you think's behind it?
There's a number of mixtures. I mean, we find that the cause of school fires quite often are works during renovation, hot works and hot cutting. Unfortunately, there are a large number of arson-related events, especially just prior to return to school quite often, where obviously people don't fancy coming back, but we do have quite a lot of children involved in arson. So for us, the importance about having sprinklers and early detection for those schools, the cost is comparable, which people make as a ideal comparison that people understand. It's about the same as fitting the carpets in a building. If you fit a sprinkler system in it at retrofit or at refitting or at building stage, which you replace carpets as sprinkler systems there to protect your building and to prevent the fire spread. And we did some work recently, moment to March. I went to a school that had in 2 neighbouring boroughs where one school had had a fire and burnt down completely, another school had had a fire in one classroom, the sprinkler system had extinguished it, and I think it was about 3 weeks before that classroom came back on the run, but the rest of the building was able to be used. So the benefits from them are huge in maintaining community and maintaining business continuity where it's a business. So, you know, that's the bit that we want to push to people, is that yes, there is an initial outlay, but the prevention part of it and the protection it gives you in suppressing a fire early is invaluable.
Well, I think that comparison with carpet is quite a useful one.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got the choice between a carpet and a sprinkler system. And I saw that you reported in the summer that 184 schools last year were being refurbished or built, and they weren't including sprinklers, which is an amazing number.
Yeah, I think it's very sad. It's an absolute missed opportunity for those buildings to put that protection in.
Do the insurance companies weight their insurance premiums as against buildings fitted with or without sprinklers?
I can just give you. We met with the ABI earlier this year to see what we could do around incentivising people, and it's an odd analysis because the biggest loss for insurance companies is water escape within buildings. So when they try to look around, do you want to install more pipes carrying water for a building? That adds the risk, and yet fire risk is relatively small in terms of insurance outcome. So again, that comes back to how you analyse those things. If we think there's a pressure from the insurance industry to sprinkler large warehouses, and we'd welcome that. That's certainly supported, but that's about the amount of financial loss that would be sustained if a warehouse is lost completely to fire. It's a shame that those things aren't necessarily applied when you think about people that die in fires and the social impact of schools being out of action for a number of times.
Well,
so it's a more complicated landscape than simply seeing it that way.
Going back to the example Dany gave, presumably it's more expensive for the insurers to rebuild a whole school than a classroom.
Absolutely. You would think so, but when you look at the numbers, and interestingly, in terms of the special services we attend, the largest number of those are around water escaping buildings, so there is something in that. So it's about how we change our narrative and talking to the ABI around how we can encourage them to be part of this message, I think.
Well, you said you put more water on it if you're squirting it from a fire.
Absolutely, that is one of the other benefits of sprinklers. So we're clearly getting the message across somewhere.
Yeah. Draft London plan doesn't include a recommendation on making sprinklers compulsory in tall buildings, care homes and so forth. Are you surprised about that? Will you be making representations at the IEP?
Surprised
ERP, right.
Sorry, we're surprised.
Well, the London plan, I know because I was involved in writing it, as you know, we made a recommendation as LFIPA that the London plan should include a recommendation that sprinklers should be compulsory in tall buildings and other buildings where vulnerable people are, but it's not actually in the result that's come out from the Mayor. Will you be making representations at the examination in public about that?
I don't know if we will do, but I think it is something that is a missed opportunity by not having it in there, because I think for all the work that we've done, the campaigning we've done, that it is something that is very important, and you know, I think that the evidence and the statistics show that it is something that should be being enforced. So,
will you be giving evidence to the examination in public?
Not that I know of at the moment.
Have you offered it?
Not at this stage, but now I'm aware of it, I'm sure we can.
It might be an idea, and that would be an opportunity to bang the drum over sprinklers and indeed other safety issues that came out in that paper that we submitted just before LPP was abolished.
Yes.
And I think there's a deadline for making bids. It's very soon.
Yeah, it's very soon, sometime next week. You have to submit a 200-word statement on each individual area to say what you want to say. It's really complicated.
It would certainly be worth doing it. I mean, every one of us that was on our FIPA spoke about sprinklers for years. So
it's not just sprinklers, it's looking at that whole package that we put forward and seeing if there's anything else that's missing.
Okay. Just one question, which is just for Fiona. At the local elections, some parties actually pledged to put sprinklers into tower blocks. But we're 5 months in and nothing's happened. Are you going to try and put pressure on those that promised it and the
authority level?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to have a conversation with Dan about sort of what we do on sprinklers, because obviously there was recommendations to me in Navinshire's report as well. and we can definitely look at that. I don't think we've mapped that ourselves, so we haven't mapped who made that commitment. So, but I think we can have a look at that. And if you're aware of any that have, that would be helpful.
Yes.
We can definitely get in touch with them, because I think where councils have been proactive. So, for example, I was delighted that Croydon, where I live, I do a little sort of party police broadcast for Croydon. They actually did it pretty quickly, and I think that there are other areas that have done. I think anything that any of the councils do to improve fire safety locally is just so welcome. That, I mean, we'd be very keen to push on that.
Absolutely, and especially if it was an election pledge, I think now's the time that
I think we can write an offer to talk to them about it and about the benefits.
Lovely. Okay, yeah. Thank you for that.
Plenty of adverts for South London today. Very good.
Absolutely.
If I could just say, we do have a sprinkler coordinator in London Fire Brigade, Nick Coleshill, who does fantastic work, and he's engaged with pretty much every local authority in London. And there are a number of challenges around whether they can put sprinklers in, including leaseholders and whatever else. So it may not be a simple backing down on their pledge. It may also be some other complications, but we are fully engaged.
We can establish any reasons behind this.
And the reason I didn't want to talk to officers, this is a political point. If somebody has pledged it and they are not keeping to their manifesto pledge and they're in charge, then from a political point of view, that's why I don't want to involve officers in that.
I think we'd want to encourage everybody, whether or not they'd made a manifesto pledge,
absolutely,
to consider it. But I think we can definitely look at that point.
Excellent, and I'm sure we can help. Okay, the last section, and we'll keep this as short as we can. Collaboration, which I'm a massive supporter of, as you know. In what ways has the new duty to collaborate affected how the London Fire Brigade works with the London Ambulance Service and the Met?
So I meet regularly with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and the Chief Executive of the LAS to talk at a high level about collaboration opportunities, and what we have had a conversation around is that what we need to look at is opportunities that are of real benefit and not just collaboration for collaboration's sake, and where we can really achieve joint working together. And what we're doing is ensuring that, so we have a blue light collaboration team that all three services subscribe to, that sits within London Fire Brigade, that makes sure that we have a number of strands that we are looking at in relation to collaboration. Obviously things like property, so where we can do joint working together, and we have a number of local initiatives already. So we have an LAS cycle team that run out of Stratford, we have a local communities policing safer communities that run out of Purley Fire Station. So what we do is we use the opportunity where we can to support each other, to have joint working, and we're looking as part of the estate strategy about whether or not there are opportunities for shared properties, and we do have sites where we have LAS and ourselves on the same shared site, and we've all signed up to a strategic intent document to look at collaboration where we can, and to make sure that we explore it in every opportunity. And for us, it's not just about the blue light collaboration, also about the GLA collaboration board as well, to ensure that every opportunity where there is benefit to be had, whether that's financial saving or improvement in service, that we are looking at collaboration opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of us went down to Stratford, and that works really well with the LAS. I believe that some of the Safer Neighbourhood teams have asked if they could come in and share our, or put in a team in the fire stations. What has come of that?
Conversations ongoing around that, because one of the things that we see as very valuable is that if we're looking at safer neighbourhoods, and it's about making communities safer, that where we've got the opportunity to work together, we can share that information, and we can make sure that we are targeting vulnerable and at-risk people, which is obviously really important to all three of us. So we are looking at those, and we do have already have fire stations that have safer neighbourhood teams who use facilities at our fire stations. So where we can do more of that, we think it's really important. Obviously there's, there can be some issues around people wanting to draw the line about not seeing us as being the police. It's very clear we're not that. This is about making communities safer and about protecting neighbourhoods.
Okay, good. I agree with all of that. Just a last question for me anyway. The unions were very unhappy about the blue light services getting together, or the Fire Brigade union that was. Has there been an easing of that view, or are they coming round to...
I think from the perspective of, I think the FBU is not keen on the merging of fire brigades so I think their main issue is with mergers. So of the mergers around the sort of police and crime commissioners taking over fire service. which isn't an issue in London. I mean, I presume on a local level there's liaison with the reps where there is joint working, but I've not heard of any particular issues around
So we make sure that we're including, and we're talking to the trade unions very early on about where there are opportunities and explaining what the benefits are and explaining the reasons behind those, and where we have the conversations about it being about working together to make people safer, then, you know, they are fully signed up to doing that. So.
And at a national level, through the National Joint Council, there's broad agreement between the employers and the employee side about expanding the firefighter role. One of the issues has been that the negotiations has included an understanding from both sides that expanding the firefighter role, which would involve sort of some of the work around co-responding and different types of work, which obviously sort of involves closer collaboration between services, would also be accompanied by a pay rise that would reflect the change in the role and responsibilities. But the sticking point in those negotiations at a national level has actually been about the lack of funding and the lack of input from the government in terms of recognising that work would take strain off other services.
Okay, well, perhaps we can come back to it at another time. I think it's a really interesting subject.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to just pick a bit up on the corresponding issue. I mean, presumably we're not doing it at the moment because of the suspension, because of the dispute in the NJC, lack of pay. But it's not just that, is it? It's also a question of training and support and equipment and so forth, and who pays for that?
So we now have, should the conversation be successful, we've got money set aside for things like inoculations to ensure we've got the right training. We have a member of the LAS team embedded in our policy department at the moment, who've been working on development of the training should it go forward. So we're in a good place that if we get the agreement to do that, that we can start putting the right things in place to actually be able to roll it out.
Well, I certainly get the impression it's not that popular when I go around talking to people.
I don't think that's true.
No, it's a mixture of popularity. There have been issues with it that have surrounded a number of different things, and part of that was initially about not people feeling they didn't have the right support and training, but people, you know, recognising that it has a different impact on people. A lot of that goes back to mental health and well-being, but people wanting the right support and training and development for it, and people feeling if they had that and the recognition for it, they'd be happy to do it because it is about saving lives. And
a lot of the concern was based on was coming from people who actually weren't involved in the pilots. Because obviously every time there was an incident that was particularly unpleasant, that information about that went out the gate quite quickly and spread concerns. And I think that retrospectively more work was needed with the areas, rather than there was a lot of work done with the people who were involved with it. There was less work done with the boroughs that weren't involved in the pilot. But that was actually where quite a lot of the concern was coming through, I think.
There's no immediate prospect of it being resolved anyway, unless the government comes up with some more cash.
No, certainly not.
I think this is something we'll come back to because I'm a massive supporter of blue light collaboration. Thank you very much indeed. Can we note the report, please, including the performance report from the London Fire Brigade and today's discussion? Can we note the work programme, note the briefing with London Resilience and delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree arrangements for any site visits, informal meetings or engagement activities before the committee's next formal meeting. The next meeting is Thursday 22nd of November 2018. Thank you very much again. Thank you.
GLA, Committee Room 5, Sound.